Ever since its inception in the early 90s, Monday Night Raw has been one of the most important institutions in WWE, right up there alongside things like WrestleMania, in fact. So, as you would expect then, pretty much any notable performer for the company has spent a good deal of time working there over the years. But who was the best performer of each year? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with 1993's top Raw star, Bret Hart. Now, back when Raw began in January of 1993, WWE was a very different place, as this was about the time that the promotion was transitioning from the Golden Era into the New Generation Era. And so it made all the sense in the world then that the top guy on Monday nights would be the guy who was leading the charge into that new era, Bret Hart. Yes, if you look back at some of those early Raws now, it's usually the Hitman who stands out the most, as he either defends his WWF title against any and all comers, or just has a banger of a non-title match. Would the same thing be able to be said for 1994 once that year came around, though? Why, yes it would, because as far as we're concerned, the excellence of execution is the only real choice to be the top Raw act of that year too, given his body of work here. What made Bret continue to be the best Monday Nights had to offer in 1994? Well, after regaining the WWF title at WrestleMania 10, he'd go back to defending it against anyone who wanted a shot at him. And this led to some pretty cool TV defenses over the course of the year. And then, of course, there was his feud with Owen Hart during this period, which pretty much dominated WWF TV and gave the company one of the best angles it had ever had. Thank God the Hitman was here to do that then, because WWF in 1994 was otherwise struggling to maintain its past relevance. And things would only get worse in that respect by the time 1995 came around. So that was why it would be Diesel who would be tasked with turning things around here as the new top act of the show. How would Diesel do in this role? Well, while he wouldn't be able to turn business around, Kevin Nash would be the #1 guy on Monday Night Raw regardless. And that was because during a year when the company was drowning in a sea of bad wrestlers with jobs gimmicks, he'd be the one who was carrying the WWF title around his waist and trying to give some legitimacy back to the proceedings, something he did by, like with Bret Hart before him, defending against all comers. Come 1996, however, the Diesel experiment would be well and truly over, as it became clear he just wasn't going to be able to get the wheels back on track for the WWF. And that's why things would move over to someone else at this point, the one, the only, Shawn Michaels. That's right, back in 1996, Raw was very much the Shawn Michaels show, as after winning the WWF title for the first time at WrestleMania 12, he'd be elevated to that level of ace of the company. And this was pretty fitting as it happened, because back then there was a real argument to be made that HBK was the best wrestler in the world. Really, the only person in WWF who could compete with him here was Bret Hart, and he spent much of the year away filming his TV show Lonesome Dove. But again, even Shawn Michaels wasn't enough to turn business around for Vince McMahon. No, the person who would do that wouldn't rise to prominence until 1997, as that was the year where, for the first time, the best Raw wrestler was Stone Cold Steve Austin. Come on now, there was really no other choice for this entry, because at a point where WWF had never come closer to going out of business, it was Steve Austin who turned things around. And the way he did this was by getting over like no one had before him with his anti-authority character, which perfectly caught on to the zeitgeist of the time. Seriously, were it not for Austin's rise here, Raw would have almost certainly been taken off the air by the time 1998 was starting, as the USA Network had at one point already made the decision to cancel it. Thankfully then, it wasn't canceled. No, instead, the flagship of the WWF would continue to go from strength to strength that year too, as ratings improved. And the person at the top of the mountain as it was doing this would once again be the mighty Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, as WWF's second boom period really got going, the Rattlesnake would remain the centerpiece of Monday nights, as now with the WWF title around his waist, he fully felt like the guy. So every week the show would pretty much revolve around him and his antics, as he did everything he could to get the better of Vince McMahon. Really, it's impossible to separate Austin from Raw's success this year, so choosing anyone else for this spot would just be silly, as Monday nights were all about Stone Cold if you were a teenager watching the show, or any other demographic for that matter. And the same thing could be said about 1999 too, as it happens, a year where the boom period continued to get stronger and Steve Austin once more stood at the top of the mountain as Raw's #1 star. Of course, as 1999 got into full swing, it became clear that WWF was going to be the winner of the Monday Night Wars, as they were starting to leave Nitro in the dust every week. But then they almost hit a bump in the road when, During the autumn, Steve Austin was taken down by injury, putting him on the shelf for the foreseeable future. Thankfully then, he had such a strong year prior to that, as he once more spent most of it going to war with Vince McMahon. The Rattlesnake was able to set up Raw well enough that it wouldn't miss a beat in his absence. Really, the only question was who would take over his mantle in 2000. And the answer to that would be, as we would all soon find out, none other than the next heir apparent to the company, the only man who could challenge Steve Austin for the spot of top guy here, The Rock. That's right, 2000 was the year that The Rock fully ascended to the level of the biggest name on Monday Night Raw. As with Stone Cold now gone for a while, it was left to the Great One to pick up the mantle and carry it forward. And boy would he do this, because spending much of the year either being WWF champion or doing everything he could to win that belt back, Dwayne Johnson would be the centerpiece of Monday nights each and every week. Would he still be in this position by the time 2001 came around though? Well, no he wouldn't. And the reason for that is because 2001 would be the year that Steve Austin returned to the top of the pile as far as Raw was concerned when he came back from his injury. Now 2001 was another crucial year for WWF because not only was it the year the Monday Night Wars ended, with WWF coming out the victor, it would also be the year the boom period ended, in large part because Stone Cold turned heel at WrestleMania 17. Even if he was a heel now though, the Rattlesnake remained the best thing about the Red brand, and his weekly comedy antics with Kurt Angle and Vince McMahon were too good to hate completely. Sure, it wasn't what fans at the time wanted to see, but to look back on it now, a lot of his work here holds up pretty well. Come 2000, however, Austin would be on the verge of walking out of WWF over frustration about his booking, and that would allow the spot of Best Raw Superstar to move over to someone else instead, someone who went by the name of Triple H. Yes, during the year where the first brand extension began and both Raw and SmackDown suddenly found themselves with separate rosters, it would be Triple H who took control of the Red brand. And the reason he was trusted in this spot was because, after making a big return from injury in January, he'd have gone on to win both the Undisputed title at WrestleMania 18 and then later become the first ever World Heavyweight Champion as well. Really then, there could be no other choice for this spot, as back in 2002 the game was still on top of the world. And he'd still be on top of the world by the time 2003 came around as it happened, because that year he'd once again be riding high as the undisputed top wrestler of the Raw brand, something he proved by continuing to hold that gold around his waist. That said, by 2003, some fans would be starting to turn on Paul Levesque, as by now he'd very much entered his Reign of Terror era, the period where he had a complete stranglehold over the top prize on Monday nights and was using his political power to bury just about anyone he came up against. Even if this was the case though, there was still no bigger name on Raw back then, at least not on a full-time basis, so he has to be considered to be the top act on the show from this 12-month period. Would the same thing be said for 2004, however? Well, no, because by the time 2004 came around, a new generation of superstars would be rising to the forefront who were hungry to take over, one led during this year by our next subject, Randy Orton. That's right, after spending some time as the rookie up-and-comer of Evolution, it would be in 2004 that Randy Orton fully broke out of the pack to become, for a little while at least, the best wrestler on Raw. But then to be fair, it was hard for him not to claim this spot here, as this was when he beat Chris Benoit at SummerSlam in August to become the youngest world champion in WWE's history. Sure, he would drop the belt soon thereafter, but nothing could take away this achievement from the Viper going forward. That said, this wouldn't be enough to keep him being the top Raw name in 2005 as well, as that year would be all about our next subject instead. Another man who first rose to prominence as part of Evolution, and who would soon reach singles stardom himself, Batista. Sure, Randy Orton might have originally been the one WWE saw as being the big breakout star of Evolution, but come early 2005, it was clear that Dave Batista was going to fill this role instead. And that's because in the lead up to WrestleMania 21, he got hugely over as a result of his simmering feud with his leader Triple H. Honestly, this was possibly the best storyline of the entire Ruthless Aggression era, and it fully solidified Big Dave as the ace of the Red brand for a while. But even then, someone would be waiting to take the Animal's place when it came to Raw's top act once 2006 came around. And if you were watching back then you'll know where we're going here, as this was the point that John Cena moved over to Monday nights. Now, for as big of a deal as Dave Batista had been back in 2005, Come 2006, it was clear that Vince McMahon saw John Cena as being the new face of his company going forward, and that was exactly why, during this year's draft, he'd moved Big Match John over to his flagship brand. Needless to say then, from there, Raw would become Mr. Hustle, Loyalty, and Respect's show as he defended the WWE title against anyone who wanted a shot at him. And it was this willingness to do whatever it took to prove to both his bosses and his fans that he was capable of being that guy that led to John Cena continuing to be the ace as 2007 came around, and Raw only further fell into the Big Match John era. Of course, it could never be any other way though, because even if some fans were audibly starting to turn on Big Match John here, he remained the clear face of the company. Hell, if nothing else, the kids still loved him and everything he did. And that was why, no matter who he came up against this year, be it Umaga, Shawn Michaels, Randy Orton, or anyone else, Monday Night Raw would very much be the John Cena show. But for as dominating as he was here, there would be someone else who'd prove to be even more dominating in 2008 as far as Raw was concerned. Who would that be? Why, our next subject, of course, the 9-time world champion that is Chris Jericho. What made Chris Jericho the best act on Monday Night Raw during 2008 when he hadn't been able to achieve this goal during the years prior? Well, this was when he shifted up his character in a major way by cutting his hair, speaking more softly during promos, and wearing a suit and tie whenever he came down to the ring. And like that then, Y2J was completely reinvented, with his legendary feud against Shawn Michaels during this spell being a particularly great example of what made him so compelling. Really, there's an argument to be made that this year represents the peak of the Demo God's entire career, so well did he do here. And while he wouldn't still be the top Raw act in 2009, as by that point he'd have moved over to SmackDown and gone on to arguably even greater success there, it would still be a heel in this role, as 2009 would once again see Randy Orton return to the top of the field on Monday nights. Yes, this was when the Viper arguably reached his apex as a performer, because it was the point he decided to go peak villain by punting everyone he could get within reach of, including the McMahon family themselves. And that led to the excellent Age of Orton storyline as, headed into WrestleMania 25, he'd be lording the fact that he was WWE Champion over his chief rival, Triple H. Honestly, there's no other reasonable choice for the best Raw wrestler of this year because, as the decade was coming to a close, Orton was on such another level to everyone else, it wasn't even a close competition anymore. Of course, this still didn't make him the guy. No, the guy would continue to do his thing elsewhere on the show, and in 2010, he'd be doing this to a level which once more made him the best wrestler on Raw, just as he had been multiple times over in the past. Who are we talking about here? Why, John Cena, of course. Now, 2010 was a rough year for WWE overall because, with the PG era now being in full effect and creative hitting one of its biggest lulls yet, there was a sense that the company was in bad need of a shakeup in order to get fans interested again. And this was something they attempted to do here with the Nexus. That said, any heel stable needs a great babyface to fight, and so it was that John Cena would rise to the occasion, as for much of the year, he'd be the one standing in opposition to the group of rookie invaders. How would he do against these invaders? Well, to the joy of all the kids watching, by the time it was over, Big Match John would be standing tall as he always did, with this only reinforcing the idea that he was the ace of not just the Raw brand, but of the entire WWE. Sure, this wouldn't be enough to get most fans excited again, but that moment would come soon thereafter, as it would be in 2011 that a new top name on Raw presented themselves as someone who could take that mantle in the form of our next subject, CM Punk. Really, if 2011 belonged to anybody in WWE, then it was CM Punk, as despite having a rough first couple of months trying to keep the new Nexus afloat, he really broke out of the pack in the lead-up to Money in the Bank. How did he do this? Well, it was here that Phil Brooks cut his now iconic pipe bomb promo live on an episode of Raw, and in the process, immediately became the most talked about high in the industry. Sure, the summer of Punk which followed on from there would eventually be botched, but none of this can ever take away from how effective it was during those early weeks and how much it reinvigorated the Red brand. So much would CM Punk become the guy fans wanted to see here. In fact, by the time 2012 came around, it would still be him in the position of Raw's best wrestler, as there was quite frankly no one else who could compete with him for this spot. Of course, it didn't help that, throughout the entirety of 2012, CM Punk had the WWE title around his waist, as this was right in the midst of his 434-day-long run with the gold. So as you would expect, each and every Monday night, he was one of the major players on the show. It doesn't matter who his rival at any given time was, be it Daniel Bryan, Ryback, John Cena, or anyone else. Once all was said and done, the Second City Saint would always manage to stay on top, even after he turned heel and aligned himself with Paul Heyman. As we all know now, though, 2013 would see Punk exit WWE under a wave of bitterness and lawsuits. And with him gone then, it meant that it was time for another former Ring of Honor star to take his place, someone who then went by the name of a man we mentioned only a moment ago, Daniel Bryan. Really, this was about as much of a lock as you could get in terms of choices, because 2013 was the climax of the Yes movement, so for that reason, it was the year that all fans wanted to do was hijack shows and let WWE know they wanted to see the American Dragon on top. Thankfully then, Bryan would get this moment at WrestleMania 30 in one of the biggest feel-good moments in wrestling history, and even if things fell apart quickly after this on account of injuries, it still made him the guy on Raw as far as we're concerned. That said, it wouldn't make him the guy on Raw for 2014, as with injuries still dogging him by this point, another former indie name would have to take his place. Luckily then, this person was right there in the form of Seth Rollins. Sure, Seth Rollins had already made a name for himself on the Red brand prior to this as a member of the Shield, but 2014 was the year he was able to break out into the singles division when he turned on his brothers Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose. And this would prove to be a great decision for him in the long run because, now with the power of the Authority behind him, Seth became the top heel on Raw and the man who usually got the most airtime of anyone as a result of this. Still though, this wouldn't be the Architect's peak. No, his peak would arguably come in 2015, as still the top heel act in the company, he'd take this to another level again, and in the process, once more, be the top performer on Raw. How did Seth level up here after the great year he had in 2014? Well, at WrestleMania 31, he'd cash in his Money in the Bank contract in the middle of the main event in order to commit the heist of the century and walk out the new WWE champion. So obviously then, this only further solidified his spot as Raw's #1 guy, because now that he had the gold around his waist, there was no one who could even pretend to be on the Architect's level, with this remaining the case all the way up until injury temporarily took him out of the game in November. And because of this injury, it meant that in 2016 someone else would have to rise to the top of the pile on the Raw brand. And as it happened, that person would be a new addition to the main roster in the form of our next subject, Kevin Owens. Seriously, what an impact Kevin Owens made on the Raw brand in 2016. After all, this was when he won the Universal title for the first and only time, and while he was defending that belt, he was involved in one of the best WWE angles of the era when he formed a bromance with Chris Jericho. A bromance so strong it saw both men get cheered by fans regularly, despite being heels. Because of these two things alone then, he's the only choice we have for Best Raw Act of 2016. Unfortunately though, this isn't enough to make him the Best Raw Act of 2017 as well. No, that honor instead goes to our next subject, Braun Strowman. But then, considering this was the year Braun was arguably at his most over, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that he'd be in this spot here. Yes, it was in 2017 that the monster among men felt like he reached his peak as a performer when he got hugely over as an 80s-style cartoon babyface, one known for doing things like flipping trucks on a moment's notice. Really, this was the point he probably should have won a world title, as his character never felt more relevant. As 2018 came around, however, some of that relevance would fade. But at least there would be other people there ready to take up the big man's mantle as the best act on Monday nights, with the person who did this the most here being our next subject, Seth Rollins. No, 2018 wasn't a year in which Seth Rollins held any world titles, but it was a year where he re-established himself as the workhorse of the Raw brand by catching fire with fans again following an excellent performance in a lengthy gauntlet match. And once this happened, it was all momentum for the Davenport native, as by the time the year was over, he'd have undergone a pretty good Intercontinental title run, one which was able to bring a little glimmer of that old prestige back to the belt. That's right, if you wanted to see a great match in WWE in 2018, then Seth Rollins was your man. But if you wanted to see a true breakout star on Monday nights in 2019, then you'd have to look to the man instead, Seth's wife, Becky Lynch. Yes, well, Becky Lynch first became a megastar the year prior when her The Man character was developed and turned her into a PG-era Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was 2019 that she fully reached her peak, as that was the year she became the first woman to score a win in the main event of WrestleMania. And once that was over, it was the Raw brand full-time for the Irish woman, as with her now holding this show's top women's prize, she had to be there week in and week out defending it and carrying the show in the process. Of course, when 2020 came around though, Becky would be gone for a while as a result of her pregnancy. and that meant the role of carrying Raw instead moved over to our next subject, Drew McIntyre. Now, 2020 was a particularly hard time for everyone. But specifically in wrestling, it was difficult for those watching, as no fans were allowed in attendance at shows. So needing someone who could bring some life to Monday nights while it was being held in front of empty arenas, then Vince McMahon decided to go with Drew McIntyre as his guy. And this proved to be a great move because, spending most of the year as WWE Champion, Drew was able to be something of a light in the darkness. But while he might have hoped to be still holding that prize once fans returned, in the end he'd be usurped by this point by the man who ended up being the best Raw act of 2021, Bobby Lashley. Sure, Bobby Lashley might have first gotten his start in WWE during the mid-2000s, but it wasn't until 2021 that he reached his full potential, as this was when he won the WWE title. And once he had that belt around his waist, he'd completely dominate the competition on Monday nights, usually with a little help from MVP by his side. Really, there's an argument to be made that this represented the peak of the big man's entire career, as after all that time, it felt like he was finally being used right. But for as great as Lashley was in 2021, even he'd fall short of being the best Raw act of 2022. Why is that? Well, because when 2022 came around, the best Raw act was once again Seth Rollins. What made Seth Rollins stand out from the pack in 2022? Well, like with prior years where he was the ace of the brand, this was a year in which he excelled in the ring, with him often having the best matches of any given week whenever he was tasked with lacing up his boots. And let's not forget it was also Seth who was tasked with reintroducing Cody Rhodes to the company here, as the pair carried Raw for a few months with their excellent trilogy of matches. Hell, that's not even getting into the Drip God's US title reign, another major feather in his cap. But by 2023, things would have changed again, and following a period out of the ring as a result of injury, Cody Rhodes would return to take the spot of Raw's best from his rival. Yes, there quite simply is no second choice when it comes to 2023 Raw, as Cody was so clearly the guy here. Come on now, with the company's hot streak picking up steam, and with the American Nightmare being a major catalyst for that revival and fan interest, it was clear that he had to be the one who was given most of the focus. No, he wouldn't win the world title yet, that wouldn't come until next year. But what Rhodes would do here would be to serve as the biggest babyface WWE had seen since the peak days of John Cena. Of course, once he won the WWE title in 2024 though, SmackDown became his new full-time home. And that meant the baton for Best Wrestler on Monday nights would instead pass over to an arguably even more dominating force, the mighty Gunther. Now, even the most optimistic of Walter fans had their doubts that the Austrian would be treated right once he reached the WWE main roster, as back then, the assumption would have been that he'd be getting booked by Vince McMahon. But once Triple H took control of the pencil in 2022, everything changed. And this meant that come 2024, the man now known as Gunther was the final boss of Monday nights in many ways, as he kept a stranglehold over the World Heavyweight title for large parts of the year. Seriously, no one could truly step up to Der Ring General here, and that made him a figure to be reckoned with. But as 2025 dawned, he'd be pushed to the side again in favor of another career revival from an old hand at this by now. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Seth Rollins? That's right, once again it would be Seth Rollins who rose to the occasion in 2025, as whether it be him winning the World Heavyweight title, forming a new stable around him called The Vision, or just generally being a thorn in CM Punk's side, he's pretty much always been the focus of Raw each week. And that's been a great thing for the brand as, like with years prior, his matches continue to be amongst the best in WWE. Sure, he might be out with injury right now, but even if this is the case, he's already done more than enough to be the star attraction of Monday nights during this 12-month period. Will he still be that star attraction once 2026 comes around? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. Whoever takes the spot, they'll earn themselves a place in the history books regardless. And the reason for that is because, with Raw still being the flagship of WWE after all these years, being the best wrestler on that show at any point remains quite an achievement to accrue, and not one which can ever be taken away.